So thank you everyone very much for joining us for this evening's Knowledge in Motion program on behalf of the Spaulding New England Regional Spinal Cord Injury Center. My name is Dr. Sherry Blauett. I work with with Ms. Bethlyn Houlihan as the co-directors of Knowledge Translation and Dissemination for the Model Systems, and we're very proud to be here with you tonight. We also want to welcome our webcast attendees. There are many of us here in the room, but we actually have folks from 26 states across the U.S. and countries including Canada and India and Sweden tuning in over the webcast this evening, so pretty exciting. We'd also like to thank all of our guests, and if he's here, I don't think he's here, but we also always want to give a shout out to our director of the Model Systems, Dr. Ross Safont, our chair of PM&R here at Spaulding. So this evening, we're going to be really taking a deep dive into the use of robotics and technology and how they can have impact on the lives of people with spinal cord injury. Our discussion is going to be led by Dr. Paulo Bonato, who's the director of our Motion Analysis Laboratory here at Spaulding, and also an associate professor of PM&R and an adjunct professor of biomedical engineering at MGH Institute of Health Professions, as well as being involved at MIT and the Weiss Institute and many other institutions around town. Dr. Bonato's research is focused on the development of rehabilitation technologies, particularly with focus on wearable technology and robotics to improve and enhance quality of life for individuals with mobility impairment. Dr. Bonato is going to be joined this evening by several consumers and also members of our team. So we'll hear from these folks over the course of the evening, but briefly introducing Tim Morris and Erick Larson, two consumer robotics users, as well as Katie Schramm, Doctor of Physical Therapy, Ann O'Brien, also from Physical Therapy, and Catherine Adans-Dester, who is Dr. Bonato's research assistant. So we have a big team here this evening, and I don't want to take any more time because it's going to be exciting. Thank you again for joining us, and now we'll give Dr. Bonato the floor. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming to this event tonight. So I'll give you a presentation about some of the technologies that we study at Spaulding. And I'll just make sure that yeah, the clicker works. It does. Excellent. And I'll take a perspective that's an engineering perspective. And the reason is because my background is actually engineering. Before I start, I'm used to lecture at courses that provide CME credits, and so you have to provide a disclosure. And I have very little to disclose. I serve on the advisory board on one of the companies that actually manufactures robotic technology, and I do that as an uncompensated position. I do it purely for the purpose of facilitating and fostering the development of technologies that are useful for our patient population. So let's start talking about the motivation of the engineering world to develop technologies that are useful for individuals who are undergoing rehabilitation interventions. And so as an engineer, the first thing that I want to do is to reassure you that we are working for you. And in fact, engineering is quite a unique profession from that point of view. What you see on the right side of the screen is the logo of the International Society of Electrical Engineering that I'm part of. And the motto of the logo is Advancing Technology for Humanity. Contrary to some of the basic sciences where you just do it for the purpose of discovering the next particle or things of the nature, right? In engineering, we really care for making sure that we actually deliver technology to end users that are useful for end users as well, and they change their quality of life as well as change technologies that change our quality of life. And so because I am an engineer, then I can also discuss with you whether engineers are doing a good job, right? And what I'm going to try to convince you throughout the talk is that we could do better, right? And I think I'm going to have a good audience from that point of view. and perhaps during the discussion, you will give us ideas about things that we should do to better meet people's needs. So I want to use the words of a good friend and colleague of mine at MIT, Hugh Herr. You might be familiar with him. He is very well known in the rehabilitation engineering community. He's a double amputee himself. Unfortunately, was in an accident. And so he lost both legs below the knees. And since then, he has devoted his professional activities to build technologies for rehabilitation applications with emphasis on prosthetics, of course. That's his area of interest. And I like very much his way to look at technologies and users of rehabilitation technologies. And Uher likes to say that, in fact, there are no humans who are disabled or person that are broken, because there is no such thing as a broken person. And of course, this is a particular meaning given his personal experience. But it's rather the environment that we build and the technologies that are broken. And so what we ought to do as an engineering community is to develop technology that actually re-enable capabilities and provide the opportunities to transcend disability. I'm paraphrasing the statement that you see there, and it's something that I assure you provides a great deal of motivation to individuals who work in this field from the engineering point of view. So let me provide, after this serious slide, a bit of a funny example, so that we get on the same page that technology is in fact broken. And then we start talking about technologies that are emerging that in fact could meet some of our requirements and wish. And so what I want to talk about is your commute, right? And I think that as much as we get a lot of advertisements about cars, cars are terrible. So I can't think of a worse time of my day than driving in and not being able to do anything else than having my hands on the steering wheel, and for an hour I'm just wasting time, right? And so the only useful thing that I do is just to listen to the radio. So, you know, I just get myself, I get the news, right? So I get myself up to date. But I mean, it's just a terrible technology if you think about it, right? And so, because we end up in a traffic jam every single morning, right? And so what if we had technology that would allow us to make the trip being engaged in other things, right? And so I was lucky enough, about 10 years ago, I was actually at Google X just visiting, and that's when they started the Google program for self-driving cars. And the way I like to look at this technology is actually an equalizing technology. So it's going to make us all equal, right? Number one. And so it doesn't really matter any longer if you're an aggressive driver and you cut everybody's way, you're going to get that in 10 minutes before everybody else, because the self-driving car is not going to allow you to do that, right? So you're actually going to go at everybody else's pace, and you're going to be as polite driving as everybody else, because you can't do otherwise. So I love it, right? But I also love the idea that, like, everybody, you know, is going to be able to go to work and be engaged in something that's more productive than just, you know, holding the steering wheel with your hands, right? And so I think that that's the way we should design all technologies. They should be, number one, good for everybody, and it shouldn't just box us in a situation where we end up wasting time in a traffic jam, for instance, right? And so that's the spirit by which we're looking at emerging technologies. And truly, we do live times that are very exciting from this point of view. If you look at, if you are into engineering, you probably remember you know, from your readings, right, that steam engine, there were actually cars with steam engines, right? And so I think the first one was actually pulled together in France, right? That was 200 years ago, right? So it took us. It was there in Boston. I didn't know it. Okay, so there must be someone else who had done it before the French. But anyway, so whatever it was, but it was quite a while ago, right? And it's only now that we get to means of transportation that I feel like it's a bit more sensible, right, in terms of the actual fruition of your trip. So, and when we look at rehabilitation technologies, we do have technologies that are still broken, in my opinion. So there are lots of limitations with the technologies that we're developing, but they are way more exciting than the technologies that we had even in the recent past. And so we're going to touch upon technologies that have been already deployed with, as I said, a number of limitations, but they're pointing in a direction that, from my point of view, is very exciting. So we will talk a bit about exoskeletons, for instance, and what we show here is the product of a spin-off company of Dr. Casaroni's at UC Berkeley, who started his project by focusing on human augmentation as part of the DARPA challenge, and then move into redesigning the technology so that it could be utilized in a rehabilitation setting. And we're also going to talk a bit about the role of technology and robotics into some of the most recent discoveries and more provocative work that people in this area have been carrying out. And this is Grégoire Courtin at EPFL in Switzerland. They're in Lausanne. And they've published over the past now about 8 years a number of very interesting studies, primarily on animal models, in which they have focused on the combinations of technology and pharmacotherapies and implants to restore function as opposed to augment function, as it's the case in the case of exoskeleton. So what we do with technology. So let's start getting an understanding of sort of the different type of applications of rehabilitation robotic technologies. Right? So there are 3 types of different interventions that we're looking at, or 3 different uses of this technology that we're interested in too. The first one is retraining functions. And there are a number of systems. I assume that most of you are familiar with the program at Spaulding. And there are a number of technologies that are utilized to improve capabilities in individuals, and they're utilized across a number of different populations, not specifically only in spinal cord injury, but certainly applicable to the spinal cord injury population. And they involve both retraining upper limb motor functions as well as lower limb motor function, and we will discuss shortly about that. There are then another set of technologies that we use to augment functions. Right? And so that is the case of the exoskeletons, and that's the case of the what we call the wearable robots, and we will talk a bit about that as well. And lastly, there are technologies that we use to facilitate restoring function. Right? So let's start with retraining upper limb motor functions. Right? Let me make sure that this runs properly. Let's see if we can get the videos running. Hopefully it's right there. And if it's not, I'll just restart it. So let's see if it clicks properly. But what I want to show you here is technology that we're utilizing to retrain upper limb motor functions. And let me see if we can get the video to run. It ran just about 10 minutes ago. It's running, good. It just doesn't show on the screen here for a second, so I got confused, right? So this is a system where we facilitate the movements of the upper limbs by essentially guiding them. And the subject is playing interactive games. So it has a virtual reality environment that is basically playing within. And, of course, you'd have to set things up to begin with, and then you start going through the routine exercises. And the interaction with the robotic system is quite relevant from a number point of view, including some that relate to the way we actually learn how to perform movements. And so these systems, if they are designed properly, they're actually designed with in mind not only the purpose of assisting the movement, but primarily, in fact, the purpose of facilitating the learning process. Okay? So this is when you have as the objective of using the technology, the one of improving, for instance, the use of the upper limbs. There are a number of different systems that are utilized in this context. The ones that you see in the slide, they're two of the most prominent systems utilized by several clinical sites. The one that you see on the bottom left is the one that was designed first. It's Neville Hogan and Igor Krebs at MIT that really did they did do seminal work in that area. And that is an example of what we call an end effector system. Is a system that essentially has a robotic arm and you have as a single point of contact with the individual. And the individual kind of plays as if it was or she was holding the hand, right, of the robotic system. And the robotic system is guiding or helping or actually making it more challenging to perform the movement. The one that you see on the top left is a system that was originally designed by Robert Reinert at ETH. ETH is like the MIT of Europe, as an excellent engineering school. And the approach that they took is the one of building, in fact, exoskeletons. So these are robotic systems that actually go around the body and wrap around the body. Not all the exoskeletons are wearable exoskeletons. So any object that goes around the body will be actually called an exoskeleton, because like in the case of the animal kingdom, if you will, right? And so you would have an object that goes around the body, right? So what are the pros and cons of this type of technology? So as I mentioned earlier, I just want to acknowledge sort of both the advantages and limitations. So we're certainly enthusiastic about the development in this area, but it's important that we also identify areas of work that we have to pursue as we move forward. And so the pros of these technologies are that number one, there is good evidence of the efficacy of these systems, primarily in different populations, the spinal cord injury population. So that's unfortunately a limitation. And there are also quite a few systems out there that have implemented these advanced control systems that I was mentioning earlier, that not only assist the movement, but they're actually designed in order to facilitate the learning process of improving the capabilities of the individual to perform upper limb functions. The cons are what I mentioned earlier, that there is limited evidence of efficacy or limited data in the spinal cord injury population of the use of these systems. It's almost anecdotal. We usually refer to evidence as evidence at different levels, and typically we do refer to scientific evidence as from level 1 to 5, where 1 is the top, and 5, of course, is basically an expert opinion. And I would say they were kind of in the middle here. We basically have pilot studies or relatively small studies for upper limbs. It's different for the lower extremities. A major limitation of this system is access. And so the current use of this system, it's really limited in terms of dosage. And you can easily imagine training. We have one of our end users just completed the marathon, right? And so, and that's not something for which you train just in a few sessions, right? And improving your upper limb functions is very similar from my standpoint in this regard. And so it's not something that you're going to you're not going to see improvements, significant improvements, just in a few sessions. It's key that the intensity be there and the dosage be there. And unfortunately, these systems, they are marked by relatively limited access because of the cost and because of the way the therapy is delivered at this point in time. So there are similar systems for the lower limbs. I'm just checking the screen, make sure that it runs properly. This is a system that we actually develop in-house for scientific purposes. We ran a project sponsored by the National Science Foundation with a colleague at Northeastern University. And specifically in that case, we were interested in the effects of manipulating the pelvis during retraining sessions for the purpose of improving gait. But that's just a video that we're showing as an example of the research work that has been done in this area, not necessarily to highlight the characteristics of these specific systems. So this slide is here just to say that there are a number of laboratories, including our own laboratory, that have developed these technologies, and then gradually these technologies are being translated into systems that can be utilized clinically. The two most prominent ones are the ones that are shown in this slide. The one on the top left is a system that's called the Locomat, and it's, again, an exoskeleton type of system. It accompanies, essentially, the movements of the subject's legs by robotic legs that are strapped to the lower limbs of the individual. And the treadmill is synchronized with the movements of the robot, and so that you can actually train on the treadmill system. There are then systems as for the upper limbs that we would refer to as end effector systems. And so you actually put your feet on foot plates, and then the foot plates are actually going to move the lower limbs, sort of mimicking the movement that you would observe during walking. So for both upper and lower limbs, there are pros and cons of exoskeleton versus an effector system. But here I'm focusing more on the general pros and cons of these systems. And if you're interested, just in passing, I want to mention, and effector systems are more difficult to use when you have joint issues, right? So for instance, if you have shoulder instabilities for the upper limbs, it's more difficult to use properly an end effector system because it's more difficult to avoid that you pull and push on the shoulder than it is if you use an exoskeleton system. Whereas exoskeleton systems are difficult to align with the joints, the anatomical joints. They're not single axis joints, and therefore it's difficult to maintain the alignment between the exoskeleton axis and the anatomical axis. But those are more, sort of technical type of issues and issues that therapists would have to take care of as they work with subjects. But from more of an end user point of view, I think what I would want to know, right, is whether there is good evidence of efficacy of this system. So it's actually worth for me to spend the time to work with this system. And there is better evidence for lower limbs systems than for upper limb systems of their efficacy. There is still some controversy around it, but in the level of 1 to 5 that I mentioned earlier, we're closer to a 2 as opposed to closer to a 3 or a 4. There are also, as for the upper limbs, good systems that are designed properly from a technical point of view to facilitate the progression of motor capabilities over time. There is still, as for the upper limbs, limited access to these technologies. So dosage is always relatively slow. The group in the lab has run recently a retrospective study on clinical data that we have gathered that show that the number of sessions that typically people would undergo varies between 5 and 10 on average. And again, if we think of sort of the paradigm of the marathon, I think it would be a bit tough to get ready for the marathon in just 5 or 10 sessions, right? So it takes a bit more than that. And so intensity and dosage here is quite an issue. In the same way you would train for a significant event like a marathon, you would want to do the same if you want to really achieve good motor function. So that's the reason why a few of us, including a few of us in the community of rehabilitation engineering, as specifically here at Spaulding, we have been looking into implementing what we like to call sort of the robotic gym as part of wellness programs, where individuals would actually have access to this type of equipment on a regular basis for interventions that are more aggressive than the type of interventions that we're running at this point in time. And I think that that is truly the future. And to make that possible, technology would have to be redesigned in a number of ways. But that's what you have to ask the engineers. You have to ask people who work for you, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, and users. You want to demand this type of characteristics for the systems that are put onto the market. So the second area that I wanted to mention, as I said earlier, right, is the use of this technology for the purpose of augmenting motor functions. And one area that we can focus on to begin with, in parallel to what we have done for retraining, is the augmentation of upper limb motor functions. So there are a number of systems out there, just really few that are becoming available, commercially available, so that are actually becoming available clinically, but quite a few that people are developing out there in the research community that I envision would be available in the clinic relatively soon. What you see on the top left is a commercially available system. It's called Myomo, and that is essentially an exoskeleton that facilitates the elbow flexion extension and a bit of hand function in the latest versions of the system. And what you see for the rest of the slide are crazy things that people are doing in the research arena. Right? So there are things that are a bit more traditional now. So that's the soft systems that you see on the bottom. And I'm acknowledging the contribution in this area by Rob Howie, who is one of the person on the right, bottom right of the slide, who is one of the fathers of the field, and is an incredible researcher. And he wanted, like often researchers do, to pick a really tough problem. And so he focused on shoulder movements. And as I believe everybody in the audience is familiar with, shoulder joints is a very complex joint to actually assist the movement of which we might want to assist with robotic systems. And there is also a colleague at WPI, actually nearby, that's doing really interesting work with soft solutions to facilitate hand movements, and that's Greg Fisher. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are crazy ideas that people are putting forward in an attempt to augment functions in the most practical way. And one of the most brilliant ones, in my opinion, is Erick at MIT. And he came up with these robotic systems that you strap around your wrist, and then the robotic fingers that are actually augmenting the capabilities of your hand. So if your hand functions are limited, then these extra robotic fingers are actually helping you in manipulating objects. Right? So I'm hoping, because Erick has a good tradition of spinning off companies and going to commercializing these technologies, that this technology will be available soon. Then there are lower limb systems, and you see one of the systems that we have here at Spaulding. We have a few. We have a couple of systems that are commercially available and a couple of systems that we're using just for research purposes. So there's the Exo from Exobionics that was originally designed by Caseroni, Dr. Caseroni at UC Berkeley. And you see the process of getting up for a chair and walking. And this particular use of the system here is assisted by the therapist who's actually guiding the movement of the lower limbs. We have also a rewalk system that you have probably seen, and it's in some of the following slides. It's very similar in terms of the way it actually the system works, just slightly different in terms of the form factor, but very similar in terms of the way it's controlled and the way the subject would use it. Just small differences that make the two systems not perfectly compatible. So it's like driving a Porsche versus driving a Ford. You don't want to switch all the times between the two because it's really not the same thing. And so, but it's not sort of a dramatically big difference between the way the two systems work. Now, if we go back to what I was saying earlier, that the technology is broken, right? So this is an example of one of those technologies for which we have a lot of enthusiasm because we see the potential, but we also see the limitations right off the bat. So it's extremely important physiologically to be in the upright position. It has a lot of great benefits from a physiological point of view. One that we're studying with funding from the Department of Defense is the effect on bone health. But it's very well documented that you have effects on a number of physiological variables. However, purely from a mobility point of view, these systems are low. Right? And so what I like that some of our colleagues have done, it's not work that we have done in our area, is to be very practical, and particularly like the work that Michael Goldfarb has done at Vanderbilt University. Right? And so imagine that you're catching a flight and you really have to get to the gate fast. You're not going to walk with Michael Goldfarb's exoskeleton because it would take you 30 minutes to get to the gate, right? And so, but what they have done is that they have designed a system that you can package. It's very compact. As you fold it, you can put it in your bag, and then you get on your wheelchair and you go fast wherever you need to go, right? And so there are still the benefits of sort of the upright position. And so I would have no hesitation myself if I happen to be an end user, right? To look at these as pieces of hardware that I'm definitely interested into. I would want to try them, and I would want to pick and choose whatever works best for me. But I wouldn't do it for the purpose of improving mobility, because moving around with your wheelchair is going to be way more practical for that from that point of view. But in terms of what we envision might happen with the technology as we move forward, this is certainly a direction that's extremely exciting for us. The picture that I put on the top left, it's something that I decided to put there not as an example of a system that I would recommend necessarily to use in individuals with spinal cord injury, but because this was taken in Chicago and they were just trying to sort of experiment with the really first exoskeleton that was put on the market by a Japanese company. And to their surprise, they got them to walk down one of the most crowded areas and nobody pay attention to them. And the reason why that is relevant from my point of view is because I think that over time we have looked into, or we have witnessed that these technologies become more and more acceptable from a social point of view, right? So back in the days, perhaps having 3 individuals walking down a crowded Newbury Street, right, with exoskeletons would have had everybody turning. Nobody was paying attention to them actually when they walked down in Chicago. I guess they must have gone down the Magnificence miles, whatever that was, right? So, but that's a report that I think is quite interesting. The other systems that you see here are systems that are relatively traditional in terms of engineering design, so what we like to call rigid frames, as well as some of the work that Connor Walsh is doing at the VC Institute as part of Harvard University with the exploration of soft exoskeleton. That's what we envision it's going to be really the future of these systems once we figure out a way to have enough force generated by these systems so that they can actually be suitable for individuals who would be otherwise unable to stand. as we deploy these systems in the field, it's key that we do that in a way that's safe, and it's becoming quite obvious to us that it's necessary that we monitor individuals in the field. Right? And so that's the concept, if you will, of the lifeline system, for those of you who are familiar with the Philips system of, what happens if a person that's part of the family who lives on his own or her own, right, kind of falls at home, right, and nobody is around, right? And so with this technology, in my opinion, it's becoming really key that this type of monitoring be put in place, right? Because irrespective of the motor abilities of the individuals who are actually wearing these using these exoskeletons, if you happen to fall with an exoskeleton, it's extremely difficult, particularly for rigid frames, to get up on your feet. Right? And so it's key that we have this type of monitoring in place for safety, but also it's key because the conditions that we simulate in a laboratory settings are very limited compared to the conditions that you encounter in real life. And so still these systems are a bit like the first cars with a steam engine, right? And so we're really at the beginning of the development of these technologies. There is still quite a bit that needs to be done. And so with sensing technology, we can remotely monitor whether there are problems and we can actually address them remotely. And so this is what you see in the slide here is sort of a schematic representation of this remote monitoring of individuals that my group, as well as many others, have implemented using mobile phones and the internet and the technologies that I trust we're all familiar with. As part of the human augmentation projects, I like to think of service robots as a key component, right? And this is something I would really like to have myself. I actually enjoy very much cooking, but I wouldn't honestly mind just going home in the evening and just tell the robots that, I just want scrambled eggs and that's it. I just want to sit on the sofa, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is actually becoming something within reach. And there are all sorts of service robots, and there are a few examples here. The one that you see on the left side is actually a system that's developed for use in combination with a wheelchair, but it actually relies upon technology that you see on the left side of the screen, and there are two of the individuals that we have contacts with. I mentioned Rob before. Bill Townsend is another collaborator of ours, and he spun off a company out of MIT about 15, 20 years ago now, almost. And what they do is that they design these robotic systems that are robotic arms that have incredible dexterity, the capability of manipulating all sorts of objects. And we are extremely excited about the next generation of systems that are coming out. And these are really a robotic system with soft interfaces. And what we mean by that is the following, right? So they kind of mimic nature to some extent. And imagine, your kids or your nephew comes in and you want to give them a hug, right? And so then your arms are going to be very flexible. We call it compliant, right? And so, but if you want to push an object, right, then what you do is that you co-contract muscles and your arm becomes really stiff. Yeah? And these robotic systems that have these soft adaptive interfaces, they're extremely interesting for us because imagine situation that you had in the previous slide where you're using, for instance, the robotic arm to help yourself as you are having a meal, right? And imagine that the robot actually controller doesn't work properly, right? Would you want a rigid robotic hand just to touch your face, right? That's going to be more like a punch, right? It's not good, right? You would rather be slapped than getting a punch, right? And so with soft interfaces, one of the key issue that we, the engineering community is addressing is that even in case of unlikely but possible errors in the control of the robotic arm, then the interface is actually not going to hurt you, right? And so, and then of course, the industry is incredibly interested in these solutions, because imagine you're picking up fruit, from baskets and putting that in boxes so it can be shipped, right? Of course, you want something that's very compliant distally, because you don't want to ruin the products, right? So very good synergy. So it's something that I think we're going to see soon in the clinic. In that context, right, we see robots that are actually roaming through the house. You might have one already if you have a Roomba, right? And for those of you who are familiar with the Roomba, you're actually seeing something similar to your Roomba on the bottom of this robot. In fact, iRobot created this system. It's called iCreate, and it's essentially a Roomba without vacuum cleaning capabilities that you can control. Yeah? And so we built all the remote capabilities, and we figure, what if we have to respond to an emergency situation, the one I was mentioning earlier? Well, let's assume we have an individual with an exoskeleton. We have sensors on the exoskeleton. We know that the subject fell, right? What do? We have a robotic system in the home setting, and the robotic system gets there. So this is, of course, a simulation that we ran into the laboratory, and sort of gives you sort of the gist of what we're trying to accomplish. In that context, robotics is very useful for mobility. And it almost made me cry that a few years ago, Dean Kamon from DECA came up with this iBot idea, which I think was really brilliant. But then they didn't manage to figure out a way to get it to fruition, right? And so the product really was a bit of a flop. It was too expensive, it just didn't take off. And luckily, they are revisiting this concept. They announced this with Toyota, right? And Toyota, I think, is large enough so that we can actually get sort of the equivalent of a Corolla version, right, of the iBot, right? The iBot, I think, was too much of a Mercedes, right? And so it didn't take off the way I was hoping to see it was going to take off. But I'm hoping that, the Toyota group is going to do a good job. And Gil Pratt, who is a Bostonian, right, he was one of the leaders of the Lag Lab at MIT, and then moved to Olin College, and then was a program director at DARPA, is now the person who actually runs the R&D in this area for Toyota. So I trust that we're going to see incredibly good things, right? Lots of these systems, they're based, like the robotic arms that I mentioned earlier, on the use of joysticks. And there are cases in which the joystick is really not a suitable interface for us, so we want something different. And there are quite a few people that are looking into figuring out what you want from your thoughts, which is a bit scary, right? From my point of view, at least, right? But it works really well if you're busy with your hands. And so I'm showing there a picture of some work that José del Milan is doing at PFL in Lausanne, in which they're using dense EEG arrays, and they interpret essentially the brain activity in order, for instance, to drive a wheelchair. So finally, I want to mention, before wrapping this up, a couple of things in the area of restoring function. This is fascinating to me, and it's a combination between technology and the biology. And there are two groups that I want to mention. There are many that are actually working in this area, but one that, in my opinion, is pursuing the most exciting ideas is led by Grégoire Courtin at PFL in Lausanne. I mentioned PFL a number of times. They have a fantastic neuroengineering program. It's an excellent school, and they decided to focus on certain areas, and this is one of their priority areas. And they have funding both from the VIS as well as the Bertarelli Foundation. And so they are in a position of launching these long-term projects where they don't anticipate good results within just a year or two. They're looking into 5 to 10 years timeframes. And Grégoire, after training there and then moving to California, it was at UCLA as a postdoc, then he moved back there, and he has run at least 2 incredible projects. One that consisted of causing lesions in rats, spinal lesions, and developing methodologies to facilitate essentially the rewiring of the spine. And so what happens often is that although a spinal cord injury might be considered complete at one level, the reality is that the damage, if you will, it's at multiple levels, and you have routes that can go around the damage on both sides. And so he developed, together with a number of collaborators, he developed a system by which they injected drugs that facilitate neurotransmission, sort of using two pathways we call serotonergic and dopaminergic. Those are essentially transmitters that allow neurons to work. And they figured out that by purely injecting drugs, they weren't going to get the rerouting they were hoping. So they designed a stimulator that actually has electrodes that go around the spine and provide stimulations with currents that are oriented properly. And then they build a small robot to get the rat actually to walk, right? So the drawing that you see there, it's actually because the robot is attached to an unloading system and is walking on the hind limbs. Right? And what they show is that you can actually get this rerouting to work, which is quite phenomenal. And more recently, they've done something similar in non-human primates. And so that's something that they published very recently, in which, as opposed to attempt to do the rerouting, they have bypassed completely the spinal cord. And so what they do is that they have intracortical arrays. They basically read from cortical areas, and then wirelessly they transmit to a stimulator that provides what we call epidural stimulation, so stimulation directly of the spine. And they actually have been able to recreate walking patterns in monkeys. And this is still experimental. It's very scientific, if you will, but the hope is these techniques are going to be available broadly in the future. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, at the end of the past month, we had an e-publication of a fabulous paper that came out primarily of a group at Case Western University in Cleveland. No offense to anybody here, it's not my favorite city, but when you look at a group that knows how to work with the stimulation of muscles, you have to go to Cleveland. They are absolutely fantastic. They do an incredible job, right? And so what they have done, again, is to use intracortical arrays. They did it in collaboration with individuals here at Harvard and at Brown University. And they implanted cortical arrays, 2 sets. They wirelessly transmitted, again, to a receiver peripherally. But now, as opposed to try to stimulate the spinal cord, they actually drove the stimulation of muscles, right? And they actually implanted 36 electrodes in the upper limbs of this gentleman, and it got the gentleman with unloading of the limb to actually be able to perform movements out of his own thoughts. So this is certainly exciting technology, at least from my point of view. Not unfortunately something that's ready for fruition, at this point in time. It's not something that it's utilized clinically, but I'm hoping that that is going to happen soon. So let me wrap this up. I want to be sure that we have enough time for the panel discussion. I wanted to convince you that the technology is broken, but there is a lot of excitement about technologies that we are developing for the field of rehabilitation at the moment. And so that's where the idea of the future is here came from. I talked to you about technology that are utilized to retrain, augment, and restore motor functions in individuals with spinal cord injury. There are quite a lot of opportunities in this area. There is tremendous potential, in my opinion, for these technologies as long as we set up programs that deliver high dosage. So there is tremendous potential for achieving good motor gains, so good improvements in motor functions when retraining is the objective. There is quite a bit that's happening also in the area of deploying technology that augments capabilities. So it makes your life easier, right? As you drive your car, right? You might want to have a service robot that prepares your meals, right? Or you want simply to improve your mobility in the home environment using these technologies. And we can make this safe by using these remote monitoring capabilities that I mentioned earlier. And there is quite a lot of interest for restoring function using a combinations of techniques and findings in biology. So part of the work that I presented or summarized earlier is work that's done by others in the US and elsewhere in the world. Part of the work is work that's done here in my lab. And so I wanted to acknowledge the contributions of people on the team. We have a mix of engineers and clinical researchers. And so I want to thank them, take the opportunity to acknowledge the contribution and thank them. So this is my contact information. I would like to propose that we move straight to the panel discussion. We take questions from the audience. We have 2 end users and 3 therapists. And so some of the questions that you might have might be better answered by end users or by the therapists. I can certainly talk about technologies, but this is what I wanted to tell you about. And if there is no time for you to ask questions in the next half an hour or so, and you're interested in gathering some information from me, you're welcome to send me an email message. My email address is right there. Please just write in the subject title that you attended this event so that I can identify the message easily and get back to you rapidly. So thank you very much. So I was going to ask people on the panel to introduce themselves. I can see that there are already quite a few people who want to ask questions, but so I'll just pass the microphone just quickly so that we can have a quick introduction, and then I can see we're set up to take questions. So.
Hello, my name's Katie Schramm. I'm a physical therapist here at Spaulding in the outpatient department, and I've been lucky enough to help in a very small way with some of the research that Dr. Bonato has been doing, and I also help work with some of the exoskeletons, both in the clinic and also as part of the research.
Hi, my name is Tim Morris. I am an end user. I've been using the technology here at the hospital for a few years now. I've been fortunate to try a few different model systems, and looking forward to answering any questions.
Hi, my name is Erick Larson. I would use this ectoskeleton for a 6 months or 6 weeks, study program.
My name is Ann O'Brien. I'm an inpatient physical therapist here at Spaulding, and then I also work as a research therapist in the motion analysis lab.
Hello, my name is Catherine Adans-Dester. I'm a PT by background. I'm working in the motion analysis lab as a research therapist with robotic technologies.
About the restoring functionality, is there any interest at all in repairing ischemic damage where there isn't just a traumatic break in one small place, but rather lesions in multiple places where there'll be multiple things to circumvent? Is anybody even thinking about that?
This would be best for a physician, so I don't know if Sherry has any comments. But certainly in the groups that I mentioned earlier, right, they are doing quite a bit of work in the area of facilitating conduction through neurofacilitation techniques, right? And so if you send me an email message later, I can actually send you a few references to papers in that regard. The work that I'm aware of is all in animal models at this point in time, though.
My comment as a person who's a paraplegic and won't drink the manual chair Kool-Aid is you got to lose the crutches. I mean, it's bad enough losing my legs, but they give you a manual chair or crutches, and you're taking my arms away too, because I've got to want to have a life where I can use my hands and my arms for doing things besides just pushing myself around. So I'm just suggesting if you could look at models that don't use crutches and leave people their arms is a place to go.
So that's an excellent question. There is a group at Virginia Tech that I've been in touch with, and we want to start a project using their technology. And what they've done is that they actually have built self-balancing systems. So if you wear it as an exoskeleton, you can't fall because the exoskeleton is going to keep you from falling. But I think this would be really interesting for an end user.
Yeah. To your comment, obviously I'm going to have to agree that it is difficult to do much while you're in the exoskeleton rather than focus on just walking. It's very difficult to to carry a plate or even a drink or anything if you wanted to.
I think right now, I think the skeleton is not designed for everyday use. It doesn't. You can't walk fast in it, so it's not practical for outdoor use. This is still something that's in its beginning stages. So that's something that hopefully they can figure out down the line, where it becomes more practical that it can be used instead of a wheelchair. But I think right now, that's not where it's at. It's just they're still trying to gather more details, and I think that's what the study that we were in is trying to help them do.
I think that's an excellent point, and if I can kind of put a little hope into it, I think even just seeing in the last few years some of the changes that have come out from a therapist perspective. So the EXO 1.1 is the one hanging here, which was kind of the original exoskeleton. They've come out with a newer version, and I've had the opportunity to work on both. And so even there's a significant difference in how reliant people are on their upper extremities in just those couple generations of change. The newer one, it can be only a cane, for example, that you're using as opposed to both of your upper extremities. So I'm seeing some hope that that's coming, because even in the last few years, I've noticed a big difference.
And I think sometimes too that even relates with how some of the therapists might view technology too, that if it seems very cumbersome or if it's going to take me that extra time to get somebody into it, that they might kind of shy away from it. So it's something that needs to, I think, be easier to get into if it's used at home or even if it's used in a therapy session, and then you can feel like it's a little bit more effective.
Oh, okay. There seem to be, I hate to use the word silos, but there, of necessity, I guess, the focus on, say, nanotechnology, and then you have further miniaturization in the electronics area, and you had a picture of the monkey up there with the able to use the legs because of the circuitry that is embedded. And I'm just wondering, is there any integrated work going on? That's the spinal issue is a huge one. And is there anything going on with the nanotechnology and the microelectronics that might accelerate the functionality of that for people?
So the second example that I showed there, so the first slide actually showed two of the animal models. Right? Whereas the second slide on the restoration of function show actually an example of application in a human subject. And in all the examples above, the miniaturization of the electronics is quite remarkable, to be honest. And imagine that what you actually do is to record neural activity from cortical areas. You wirelessly transmit it, right? And you process it so that you can infer the movement that the subject is attempting to perform. And then you deliver wirelessly to the stimulation device. And the stimulation device is either going to deliver stimulation to the spine, or it's going to deliver stimulation to muscles in a way that's actually coordinated in such a way that the motor output corresponds to the movement that the subject is trying to perform. Right? There is certainly more that people are attempting to do in that area, but I think that in terms of miniaturization of the system, we're pretty much there. I don't think that we're going to need a lot more progress from that point of view. I think that the obstacle now is more along the lines of the reliability of these systems and the clinical studies around this technology.
We have a question on the webcast. And first, thank you for providing such a fascinating and thought-provoking information. It's great to see biology and technology combined for such a great cause. I'm currently 3D printing. How will 3D printing reduce the cost and improve exoskeleton technology and the lives of SCI and other patients? Thank you.
So I can speak very quickly about it. There's quite a lot happening in that area. With Northeastern University, we have explored the capability of scanning the body using traditional photographic techniques, but with multiple cameras, so that we can achieve 3D reconstructions of body segments. And for instance, 3D printing is a fantastic technique for us to design systems, to print systems that perfectly fit the body, so they're actually very comfortable to use. We have done that with ankle foot orthosis, for instance. We haven't pushed that from a research point of view, simply because I'm going to sound not very modest here. So it's a good idea, right? And so companies just pick it up. So you can actually buy these things out there. So there are actually people who work in our group, right, that were hired by companies that now actually do this type of work out there, right? And so it's fantastic from my point of view. It's a really good thing. It's a really good thing when we can get to a stage where we can say, oh, this is a project that we're going to terminate because the industry picked it up, and now the service that's provided to end users, it's what we wanted to see in place. So that's an ideal outcome, right? So, but I wanted to take the opportunity, if there are no more pressing questions from the web viewers, right? I wanted to take the opportunity just to do a round here with the panel, right? And so, because we have here individuals who are using this system clinically as well as end users, I wanted to hear from the panel about your experience, what you see as pros and cons. And because, you know, we have another, 15 minutes, I'm just going to cut it sort of to the chase. And I also wanted to hear from the panel what they would like to see as technology, what, as end user, you feel like would be your dream, right? And so if you had, we kind of play these games from time to time in a research environment. We say, okay, if you had unlimited resources and, the sky's the limit and you could do whatever you want, right? Because you have all the engineering community ready for you, and NIH is putting money on you, right? And so what would you like to see happening over the next few years?
Well, maybe I can start by speaking to some of the pros and cons, just in my experience as a clinician working with folks within these gait training devices. I think that from an early mobility perspective, especially folks that have recently been injured, they provide a significant opportunity for any neuromuscular reeducation that we can do, and it really gives the folks that we work with an opportunity to be upright, to be standing, to be weight bearing, which we know that there's so many benefits to that early on, that it sets the foundation for that for folks. And then even individuals who have a more chronic injury, it can really provide them the stability and the alignment to be in that weight bearing position and practice some gait training. So I think those are kind of non-measurable benefits to the systems. Some of the drawbacks are it is cumbersome. I think the technology has a ways to go to make it a little bit more user-friendly, a little more fast to put on and take off, just to make it a little bit more functional. And then myself as a clinician, I think one of the downsides I see is that we can't fit these robots to everyone. So there's only so much wiggle room we have in adjusting these robots as they are currently. So there are a lot of folks that, while theoretically they're very appropriate for the interventions, we can't get them in the device because they're too tall or their ankles are too tight or things like that, which as a clinician you hate to see. You hate to turn somebody away because we can't adjust the robot enough to fit them. And then I think one of the other downsides that you alluded to is there's this counterbalance with our current healthcare system of access. I think that's a hard component that we don't really have a good answer for quite yet, is if the research is really supporting that these devices are helpful, how can we maximize people's access to them and actually allow them to gain the benefit from them?
Well, as a user, I think many of the pros have actually been touched on tonight. The physical benefits, the weight bearing, the bone density, the ability to ambulate, to walk, and still have the stimulus of the pounding of the foot for your bone density is significant over passive or active static standing, standing in place. I've noticed it's been a few months since I've been walking in an exoskeleton, and I've noticed a drop in muscle mass, and I can feel a little bit more I can feel contracture beginning to set in through my hamstrings and in my hip flexors as I'm spending more time sitting down. The drawbacks, I agree, not being able to use your hands, but as we've discussed, that technology is coming. The donning and doffing of the suit, the ability to get in and getting in the suit by yourself, getting out of the suit by yourself, it's difficult now. I'm sure that technology is coming.
Like I said earlier, I did on a short 6-week study, so I didn't get to feel as much of the bone density as Tim did here. But for me, what was nice was just the change of pace of being in a different position, looking at somebody in the eyes instead of looking up at them. Whether it's the therapists that are working with us or my family that came in with me. My son came in one time and he looked at me and goes, "I forgot how tall you were." Because he was also, he's 21 now, so he is this tall as if I was standing, but when I was injured, he was as tall as me sitting down. So for him, it was just like, oh, wow, yes. And for me, it was a lot of work to walk. It's not just simple, it's not just simply standing up and one leg moves and the other leg moves. You've got to do a lot of work. You've got to move the crutches a certain way. You've got to shift your body left or right, depending on which foot you're moving. You've got to hit certain targets so the machine will work for you. So it was a lot of, I would leave this tired. My arms would be very well shot. And some days I had good days where I'd walk 500 steps and other days I'd walk 300 steps. Just depending on how my body was working that day and whatnot. Yeah, it's, you know, it's a newbie thing. It's going to take some time to get to that next level with it, I think. Um, you know, being able to use it, being able to go faster would be nice. That was one thing I joke with the girls all the time. I says, you know, let's put the run speed on, because, you know, I could get to a point where I could use it on my own, but it was still a very slow process. It wasn't a normal gait. It was still took a lot of work. So that's what I would like to see, you know, in the future, if it becomes better, you know, to be able to go at a normal pace.
Yeah, and for the record, you're still taller than your son.
Yeah.
We measured. I'll comment, I guess, on the wish list since you asked. I'm hoping that's the new Spaulding photo that you had up there with the giant room with all the different robotics and people using them at the same time. But I think that is one of the limitations, is that, say, like for when you're doing therapy, that there is like a setup time, and then the time that people are actually maybe using the robotics is a little bit limited, and we always want more time. So in a perfect world, I think if getting somebody in and out of the robotics, or maybe somebody that isn't, you know, your licensed therapist, you know, could put them in it, and then you could still have another session that you could do some other types of training with them, whether it be the arms or the legs, would be great. And having it, you know, a little bit less expensive, so then maybe you could have a couple devices, because even now I'm thinking of like the Locomat that we have upstairs. I could imagine two people being in, you know, one being in, if we had two devices, and one therapist with two patients would be a lot more effective, and I think it actually would be something safe that we could do, and it would be a little bit more productive. And so, you know, so there's certainly the cost and space and time of the therapist using it with skill. And then for home use, I think it would be great if there was more access to, you know, lightweight, cheap, you know, cheaper types of devices for, you know, helping people to be able to, you know, self-feed or something like that. It's really not that feasible for home use. It might be more better used like in the clinic setting. So if, you know, some of the engineers can make something newer and safe and a little bit less money, that would be great.
I'm not sure what I can add from what Katie, Eric, Tim, and Anne already said. Maybe I can add something to the wish list. I think there is a lot of technologies available out there, as you may have seen in the presentation. Something that I would like to see in the future is it's sort of gyms, or like even area where you have all the technologies, or almost all of them available, that you can, as an end-on user, even as a therapist, go with your patient and actually try different systems to try to figure out which one would be the most appropriate, the one which is the most comfortable, because something that works from one client will not be the same for the other one. So especially when the technology is still very expensive, there is really a need to be able to try to experience it a numerous number of times before actually investing in the technology. Perhaps also getting into those robotic gym concept, in which you can go and like pay a small fee and actually have therapist or rehab aid helping you to use those devices and get your exercise done.
So I'm just going to look at the organizers. I think we want to wrap this up. Sure. You have another question?
I do, if
you
I
have
could. And you just about answered it on the panel, but not quite. And so question is, how do people even get robotics like Rewalk? Does insurance cover the purchase of an item like this?
So that's it's not a simple answer. So there have been, Rewalk is one of the only FDA approved devices for home use, and there has been some that have been covered by some private insurances, and it's a very lengthy process. I have not personally been involved in it, so I can't speak to the specifics of it, but similar to other forms of DME, you know, durable medical equipment like wheelchairs and things like that, it was a very almost exaggerated process comparable to that, where there was a lot of letters written, a lot of folks that needed to be advocating for it in the background, and it took the few that have been covered took quite a bit of time. A lot of the other devices are not FDA approved for home use, so they're currently just used in the clinic. And that's not possible right now. But ReWalk is one of the ones that has, but it's only a few insurance providers. From a clinical standpoint and even a use standpoint, that becomes challenging, and that's kind of something that some of these companies are currently working on with different insurance providers. But unfortunately, some of the insurance providers don't cover the use of these robotics as even treatment options for folks. And one of the things, or one of the challenges with such a evolving field as technology, is the research struggles to catch up and keep up with the changing technology. And then the insurance companies are always looking for that research to justify whether or not we can use it in the clinic. So it's kind of a ongoing discussion and something that we're all working towards kind of maximizing.
I'll just add just one element. So there are quite a few companies that are actually trying to manufacture these systems at a very reduced cost. So what we have seen over the past 5 years is the emerging of companies that are trying to manufacture and commercialize these systems for about 1/4 to 1/5 of the cost that these systems had just a few years ago. So I don't have sort of the price list, so I'm going just to tell you ballpark, right? So one of these systems that are used in the clinic would typically go for about 100,000 to 130,000, right? These systems that, so I mean, I can say, because you guys can just Google and you're going to find it, right? So the Phoenix system that Casaroni is designing now, they're aiming to commercialize it for 20 to 25. Right? So there has been quite a push toward acknowledging the fact that, you know, this technology is not going to fly if you have to spend the equivalent of 2 Lexus cars, right? It's going to fly if it's going to be ballpark in sort of a Corolla, right? Type of price range, right? And so in that case, it's going to work. And so, and from the engineering point of view, that is possible.
So we do need to end the program for tonight, but if anyone has any other questions, you can distinctly email and Paulo will be able to answer. You can let him know, anyone that's on the webcast or in the room. We are really glad that we got to have you here tonight. I guess the last thing we'll just say is that we are very grateful that you all came. Thank you for being here. We're very grateful. And we have our next lecture is going to be coming up for Knowledge in Motion on June 22nd. Jennifer Coker will come from Craig Hospital to present on alternative and complementary medicine in SCI. And so thank you. That concludes the evening, and I'm sure they will be around for a few more minutes if you have any questions and want to speak with them. Thank you, everybody.